Presence, the podcast for everyone interested in bodywork, embodiment, and somatic practices. I'm Andrew Rosenstock, your host and guide on this enlightening journey. With my expertise as a somatic movement therapist, yoga therapist, and certified Rolfer, I'll merge clinical insight with real-world experience to enrich our discussions with our guests. Through engaging and informative talks, this podcast delves into mind-body paradigms, offering insights and strategies to empower personal growth. Your support is vital for our grassroots and lo-fi production. If you connect with our content, please leave a positive review and subscribe on your preferred platform. Your engagement helps us reach a broader audience and supports our mission. So thanks for tuning in today to Touching into Presence. Fasten your seatbelt as we embark on a journey to explore the transformative power of contemplative and somatic practices together. It was a pleasure to be in conversation today with Konrad Obermeier. Konrad is a certified advanced Rolfer and Rolf movement practitioner based in Munich, Germany, where he also teaches anatomy for the Rolf Institute and offers advanced training in visceral and neurovascular work. Deeply influenced by the developmental movement of the embryo, Konrad's approach blends structure, intuition, and a reverence for the body's formative intelligence. He spent over 25 years immersed in the work of Erich Blechschmidt, including a decade-long friendship with Blechschmidt's widow, Traute, who entrusted him with access to the original scientific writings. In today's conversation, we explored how embryology has shaped Konrad's way of seeing, less as a set of techniques and more as a perspective on life, development, and relational presence. We discussed how environment, not just genes, guides growth, the philosophical roots of structural understanding, and how concepts like pressure, tension, and form help reframe what it means to touch another human being. Konrad shared his views on morphology, modern science, and the joy of being in lifelong study. A humble and passionate teacher, he offers a way of thinking about structure not as fixed anatomy, but as movement shaped by relationship. I'm hoping to have more folks on to talk about embryology and its importance in embodiment and body work. But with that all said, let's get into the talk. Hi, Konrad.
Hello.
You're back in Germany, correct?
I am back in Germany, countryside.
Nice.
Here I am, yes. Well, I think I'm just available for a conversation. And thank you for contacting me and inviting me to your coming into presence is always a good idea, no? So yeah. I feel honored to be reminded to that most precious mode of being.
You know, I first came in contact with you through the journal, which I think has changed names numerous times. So we'll just say the Rolfing Journal, and I think now it's Structure, Function, but yeah.
Through Rolf lines.
Well, yeah, through Rolf lines. That's way before my time, but yes, but through Rolf lines. And I remember first reading your articles and being like, there's something here, but I don't understand it. And then later saying, I understand it a little more, and slowly moving more into embryology and just really understanding how, or maybe not understanding, but recognizing how important it is towards our work. And yeah, so just happy to be in conversation about that. And probably in particularly, I'm guessing we'll move into Blechschmidt because I know that that's where you are, you're oriented around that. But I guess initially my question is, how did embryology become what it is to you, or how did you get involved or interested in that in particular?
Well, my very initial thing was during my Rolfing training. Actually, one of the teachers would say that embryology is something very important for our work, but we just don't have time for it. Okay, I thought we don't have time for it. And coming back, I thought, well, it's really an interesting thing because how does structure come along? And if we are claiming that we can change structure, maybe it is helpful to understand how structure invents itself. How does that happen, that this small little round ovum gets fertilized and then makes all these things, and at the end we have an adult body, And we call that a structure, a biological or a human structure, and we can change that. So I started reading into buying embryology books. I think I bought half a dozen of different embryology books and then never finished any of these books because all of it didn't make any sense to me. It just didn't make sense. And then actually facilitated by Kevin Frank, my friend Kevin, gave me this book with the funny sentence like, here, you have a look at that. You probably like it. He's German too. That was his comment. He's German too. And I started reading Blechschmidt and started to get like key phrases like developmental movement, starting to understand that structure per se is a movement. And I was very much involved then in these years in the 90s, in the mid 90s, doing a lot of continuum movement. And movement in that sense was a very important part to my formation of understanding the body. I did a lot of yoga before, but that was kind of really the key to movement for me. The continuum movement thing with specifically with Susan Harper and also with Emily. I'm really grateful that I met her as well. And then from there on, I started reading into Blechschmidt, and I thought, like, holy moly, the language is not easy. It's not friendly to read. But the German made more sense than for me because initially I got it in English. And then I started digging into that whole field of the Blechschmidt universe. And through Susan Harper, she said, wow, this is a great image. Can I have the rights to use this embryo image in my flyers? So I started to investigate, and I finally found the widow of Erich Blechschmidt. Traute Blechschmidt was still alive. I contacted her, and then I was driving to Freiburg, and I ring the doorbell, and with flowers and the whole thing, and ring the doorbell and say, and then she invites me in, and we have a tea, and then we have a conversation. And from then on, there was this 10-year friendship that I developed with Traute Blechschmidt, the widow of Erich Blechschmidt, visiting her 3-4 times a year and having coffee and breakfast and lunches, dinners, and talking. And that really was pulling me into. So it was a personal meeting with Traute Blechschmidt that really opened that universe for me because she was a very, very interesting source of information of the personal life of Blechschmidt and all that kind of many, many years and his character. So that really brought me into. And then I was just getting more and more fascinated. And the whole universe, the whole Blechschmidt universe started to open over time. But it was not an easy read. It was not an easy beginning. But over the years now, 25 years of looking at that, you finally get some interesting things that you start to understand what structure, as we call it, what structure and the development of structure means. That was my journey there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was unaware of your background in continuum, so that is a piece that makes definitely some sense to me. But when you were speaking about reading Blechschmidt in his own language, reading any author, I really enjoy Haruki Murakami. He's a Japanese author, but I can't read Japanese. I read the English and it's great, but people always say, oh, if you can read the Japanese, it's even more so. Just thinking about that, even as you were talking about getting that from Kevin, it sort of occurred to me, oh yeah, reading the German of it, I'm sure there's a difference within that, especially as I find the German language to be, you have so many more visceral words. You have so much more that connects into than the hodgepodge of English. No disrespect to my mother tongue, but there's just something. I used to struggle with German a lot, but actually, as I started to learn more about it, there's so many beautiful phrases or ways of wording the world, and I could just see how, even in reading about embryology, how I read I'm going to get the name wrong, but Blechschmidt's onto genetic basis. It was a tough read where I got done reading it and saying, I think I understood 0.1% of that book. It's
Yeah, it's very true. And in the same time, Blechschmidt didn't speak English at all.
Mhm. Yeah.
Blechschmidt said, I'm not interested in learning English. My embryos don't speak English, he said.
Mm-hmm.
And he had these English books. It's the Biokinetics and Biodynamics that was written by Raymond Gasser.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Brian Freeman, who translated the ontogenetic basis of human anatomy. And both of them stayed with Blechschmidt in Germany at the university for a year. They had a sabbatical and they studied with him. And they actually did the English writing because he did not write or speak English in a sufficient way. So he had a very clear, very German depiction, very German wording where he coined many of the phrases that were pivotal for understanding his work. Yeah.
Mm.
But the linguistics is one thing, the difficulty of reading. It is tough, not just in terms of the grammar and the way how he puts things, but also the love for the detail and the consistency. So many people give up by all these details and feel overwhelmed. And I think basically there is a number of principles that you need to get down, and then step by step by step, this opens. So I'm doing small workshops where I introduce people to the languaging, to the work, to the universe of Blechschmidt, and then reading this, the feedback that I'm getting is that oh, now I see. Now I have a guideline, so to say, through this languaging of Blechschmidt and through the concepts that he's presenting that are very, very coherent in the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say even for me, reading your articles was helpful more so in understanding Blechschmidt's work. So going back and sort of reading how you write it, and I can say, oh, okay, again, at first I couldn't, but like many things, we can't. It's too new. It's too revolutionary for us. But then later coming back to it, we can say, oh, okay, I've had these other experiences, this other understanding, and it was or it has been helpful. I'm sure it will continue to be helpful in understanding that. What this is probably a longer question, but for you, how has that, or if it has, how has that work affected how you practice body work?
That's a very good question. And that's also, I completely understand that the interest in embryology in that sense is not really overwhelmingly big because you don't learn techniques here. You learn an understanding of your own personal journey. How to say, um, evolution is a concept, and I think it's a great concept, but the ontogenetic development is something that we did. All of us were going through that, and we are practitioners. We are practitioners of the embryology, and we are just, in my understanding, we are late embryos. The principles that build up the first blastocyst, the first units, all these principles stay the same. And as a practitioner, you don't learn a technique, but it starts to inform you when you go deeper into the embryological ideas. It starts to inform you what you're dealing with, what structure means when you get that radical point that Blechschmidt is proposing, that the environment is driving the show and we are answering the influences that come from the outside towards us. and how we integrate them and differentiate and grow through these information. And you can say molecules is information or energy or whatever, but it is a relationship to the environment. Early on, it's the environment of the womb being inside another organism, but it is the relationship that is formative. And that's kind of a really eye-opener and a mind-opener, I think, when you start to understand that the world is coming towards that little implanted organism that is compensatorily trying to maintain its unit by integrating oxygen and sugar and pizza and beer and pizza and soy drink and yeah,
Well, in Germany,
and
beer. In America,
that,
probably now. So I was going to say, in Germany, beer, sure. In America, soy drink and whatever's trendy.
yeah, a vegan muffin. So there is these influences that come from the outside in, and that's how biology builds the body. We are integrating food, if you like, molecules, and depend on that relationship of the hormonal state of the mother, of the energetic state of the mother. It's a huge, big universe, but the basic direction for growth and differentiation is a direction from the outside in. The organism takes from the world things, molecules, and integrates them, and has obviously a potential then to manifest growth, become bigger, and differentiate from the inside out. It's like many of us, and you see that with clients, when they think like they are made up of parts, and that the parts make up the wholeness of them, but it's the other way around. The wholeness is always there, and the wholeness creates the part in the pathway of towards a more differentiated presence. As a practitioner, it is something where I think I have understood that so much that this is the place where I'm coming from when I'm working with a person. It's not a technical question. It's an understanding question of how do I look at the person in front of me, and how does that inform me in my approach and in my relating. That's how I would say that, understanding that you are part of my environment as I am part of your environment, and the relational is the major question.
Yeah, for me, that like there's a few reasons why I ask. One is to share for others, but also my own curiosity around as I became a biodynamic cranial sacral practitioner. Embryology was talked about and taught here and there, and looking at sort of that force. Apart, and then also a study. I just finished the weekend with Jeff Birch. I don't know if you know Jeff, but also he brings embryology into his work as well. And for me, exactly, the technique is not so important. I think that if you understand the principles, if you understand, and so even thinking of embryology as you're saying it, if you understand, what I wrote down was, if you understand how we got here, how we formed in the process to be here, we have more in our actual fingertips. It's an area that I do want to learn more about, but I struggle to. I haven't fully really learned how the three layers do form over each other. I'm in that process of looking at how the meso, the ecto, and the endo.
Doesn't matter. That's not important.
You don't think it's important?
No.
So when you, because some people who work embryologically, when they are touching someone, they are, at least according to them, aware of how this layer unfolded upon this, and so I'm working with this skin, but also aware of how the whole entire process has gone in there, and what may have shifted, and how that may have a relation. And for you, that is less important. or not important at all?
No, it is. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. Yeah. But one thing is, I think that the osteopathic, the biodynamic osteopathic community is to a certain extent occupying the basic work of Blechschmidt. And then you have the question, what is the matrix behind and what is the energy field and all that kind of, Blechschmidt is basically describing how the wave becomes a particle. If you take that as a metaphor. And the biodynamic osteopathic field has occupied and understood Blechschmidt to a certain extent. I'm not so sure how much of Blechschmidt they understood, but they understand that there is something. And for me, in terms of the structural work, there is some very, very simple principles. And the difficulty in grokking that is nobody is interested in morphology anymore. Morphology as a biological, as a scientific field is practically dead. And nowadays, embryology is a part of genetics. And genetics is the major thing since the last 20 or 30 years, because they have that DNA that you can study, and you are doing this, and you have CRISP, and then you manipulate that, and all this kind of thing. So there is tons of money going into genetics, and every smart scientist has to go where the money is so that they can run their show. But to understand morphology is of no interest anymore. And that was basically what Blechschmidt was describing, the becoming of form. And today, the becoming of form is just not a really hot field in science or in biology, but it's genetics. And the understanding then, in my understanding, misleading thought is that the DNA is the central aspect of the organism. And when we study that and understand that and manipulate that enough, then we can heal, and then we can correct, and then we can whatnot, all these kind of things. And Blechschmidt had a radically opposite point of view, where he said that the DNA is a fixed point. The DNA is the most stable aspect of your metabolism. The DNA is the same in all your cells from the first day to the end of your life. And yes, they vary a little, but it is a fixed point. It's a fulcrum in your physiology. It's a fulcrum in the creating form. But there is nothing coming from the DNA. The DNA answers an external question. The world is the question, and it is transferring, meeting the DNA expresses, and then, but it's the other way around how he looks at it. The world is active, presenting you with a question, and if you can answer that question successfully, your life continues. But the DNA is not proactive. The world is active.
Yeah.
And that's the basic understanding I have of Blechschmidt, and I think that's not well understood, and it doesn't help. If you see genetic as the central aspect, then the morphological question just falls off the table.
What I hear you saying is an age-old thing, that science, or what we can observe, will always trump philosophy, because we can observe it, we can get what we can see out of it, and we can have our sort of data and then make our statements, which later on we will disprove, but that doesn't matter. We will keep. So this, what I hear you saying is Blechschmidt is really a much more philosophical. Let's start to look. How could we even measure the world? And so because it's harder to see. In fact, I'm reminded of a client who came to see me, and she was a neuroscientist, and I said, Are you a neuroscientist, or do you have background in neurobiology or neurophilosophy? And she said biology. And I said, well, this is going to probably be harder for you than it would if you were a neurophilosopher. I said, because what we're working at I don't know, we're working with, I don't know if that can ever be measured, that force that even sparks the embryo, how that comes. And she said, well, we just haven't measured it yet. We'll get there. And that sort of drive for that science, I think, what I hear you saying is in that.
Yeah, I think it is obvious in one end that when the pregnant woman takes drugs and alcohol or medicine, you can damage the embryo. There is something coming from the outside in towards the embryo that it cannot deal with.
Mhm.
And so that's obvious in that case that with alcohol abuse or whatever, the babies stay smaller and they have deficits in learning later on. So it's obvious that the environment provides pivotal information. And when we assume that the environment provides normal, quote, quote, information, healthy food, good environment, not too much shock and trauma and whatnot, and the hormonal thing for the mother, then the embryo can do its thing by adding these substances from the outside in, and then inevitably the DNA will give the right answer. But the DNA cannot answer correctly incorrect questions, if you like that. So if you have medication, like we had the Contagan or something, you add medication, pregnant women take medication that is a poison towards the developmental movement of the embryo, then the answer of the DNA cannot be correct.
Mhm.
So it's a question of which way around do you see that? And the DNA is absolutely important. It's not that Blechschmidt denies the DNA, but he looks at it from the other side. He looks at it from the environment. The environment, to make it more simple, I would say that the environment is a question, and the DNA can answer by evolutionary accumulation of knowledge, if you like, can answer so and so many questions. And when it does that, then you have an adult human being. If the environment is providing questions that the DNA cannot answer, then that's it. Our problem in a certain way is, I think, as practitioners of our work, we are referring in our mindset to Vesalius, to anatomy in a way that we look at the adult form and we think that this is structure, like the skeleton that is behind you on the wall and these anatomical drawings that depict an adult body. That is structure. But we don't see that this structure is a movement. That's what's mistaken, so to say, by Vesalius doing this amazing job of writing the first anatomy book ever, but he looks at the adult form, and so we think this is structure. And when I do class, I say to my students, look, let's go to the beach. Yeah, we go to the beach and we look at the sea, and then you see the waves come in. You have the body of the ocean, and the waves come in as a function of the body of the ocean.
Mhm.
And now you better brought a chair because we have to wait much longer to see high tide and low tide as another function of the body of the ocean.
Mhm.
These two functions are overlaid. They have completely different underlying reason, the moon or the wind. And the waves don't care about the moon, and the moon doesn't care about the wind. So you have waves as a function and high tide, low tide as a function, and they go together. We are used to, when you work on a shoulder, you work with function in the sense of wave. When you work with structure as a developmental movement, you work with high tide, low tide movement. You have a very different orientation. I think that's, as a metaphor, gets to a certain extent the idea that Blechschmidt was trying to get across.
Because a lot of my education has been muddled together. So I know that Blechschmidt was adopted by the biodynamic folks, but and in biodynamics they do talk about the breath of life and other. But does Blechschmidt, does he go into it all about sort of how how this force is directing?
No, not at all.
No.
Blechschmidt was a very religiously spiritual person, down to the bone Catholic. Yeah, he had a very religiously spiritual frame that he came from in respecting life to a big extent in the frame that he lived at. Yeah? There was no Buddhism around or stuff. He was born in 1896, I think, or something. So he had that frame, and he states it very, very clearly that there is a physiology, there is a genetic, there is a biology, there is forces, there's physical forces, pressure and tension, that are all of them are very important. And then there is things beyond the chemistry. There is something beyond all of these things that you can see and describe. But he doesn't specify in any of these ideas of like the biodynamic field or an energetic matrix, and he does not specify or go there at all. He was trying to be as scientific to his frame as possible. And we have to understand that his first scientific paper was published in 1931. We cannot even fathom or imagine a scientific, a biological, a medical lab in a university in those years. Yeah? I mean, primitive, it's 100 years ago. That's kind of so primitive to our mindset now with our computerization and all this, all this kind of thing. It is very difficult, I think, for us to imagine. And I remember Frau Blechschmidt saying, when his students would present him the first electron microscope, he would work with optic microscopes, and then they present him this electronic microscope, this potential of looking so deep into molecular structure. And he had a look at that, and he did work some with that, but he was not really impressed. He said, well, what you see now is a detail, but you completely lose the overview. You lose the context. You get lost in a detail of something, but the context, how that thing relates to the overall organism, you cannot see. It's too deep a detail to be of interest for his idea. When he was studying details, he would always refer to the overall organism. That's his serial reconstructions and things. How do you see the overall organism participating completely in every minute step of the developmental movement?
I'm not sure if this is what you or he were saying, but it makes me think a lot about when I first started, let's just say Rolfing. I've been doing other body work, but when I first started Rolfing, I was so lost in the detail that I didn't, even though I believe I was following this recipe, so I could say, hey, I'm doing this in a larger picture. I was at that point too focal to see how that particular was in that moment affecting larger and larger. And through time, the ability to not necessarily lose the detail, but to bring the detail into a wider spectrum of perception.
Yeah, I think what I hear is the art of body reading. What in the beginning you see the shoulder is low, but you don't see that the liver is stuck, and you don't see how that rotates the other leg. And so to learn that, to see a detail plus seeing the context of the overall organization in gravity, as Dr. Rolf said, that's the art, so to say, that we learn. And I think that's inevitable in a didactic way of how do you teach Rolfing, how do you learn Rolfing. You need that much detail, but never lose the overview of seeing the bigger picture. And I think Blechschmidt did something in a similar way. yeah, in his lab, in his studies, in his trying to see the overall context and how the detail relates and informs the organism as a whole. And that's what we learn, I think, over the years, and it's a slow process for many of us. Like for me, it was a slow process of grokking that kind of thing. Like, okay, there is this thing, and then oh yeah, and then there is something in the leg. But until you see that this is one that is codependent and does something to the iliosacral joint, you know, then, oh, that takes that takes a little
Well,
while. Yeah.
yeah.
Took me
Well,
a little.
for me, I think it was that, but then also, how is that structure, that body, that human, moving through the world? So how is that human in relation with this external world? I think at first I was able to see bits of more what, I could work on the shoulder, but have four or five other places. Of course, as I studied like visceral manipulation, more stuff became aware of, but it was still a bit focused on the organism themselves and not the organism in relation to other than body. And that
Mm.
way of holding them, of being with focal points, but also, but there, there's a whole relationship towards their way of the world meeting them, of them meeting the world, that
Yeah.
is, yeah, yeah.
I think there's the difference really is from the embryological point of view that what Blechschmidt is studying, what he's describing, more or less covers the first 3 months, so that the shape and the form and the organs are basically there, and then they get bigger and more differentiated. But that's a purely biological point of view. When we are working with an adult or a teenager or an elderly person, we are working not with the biological structure alone, but we work with a cultural anatomy and we work with the family anatomy, because you learn meaning of the body very different in the royals or in the proletarian
Mhm.
areas. And then how do you use it? Do you play violin 6 hours a day, or are you shoveling coal for 8 hours a day? That will shape the body different. So when we are doing practical work in structural integration, we have the biology, the culture, and the family, and we have all of that together. And Blechschmidt was purely looking at a biological place, because there is no symbolics any. There is no languaging, there is no symbolics, there is no family. In that sense, it's about a biological organism per se, that then gets much more complex with the socialization and languaging and all this kind of symbolizing things, where we just cannot get rid of the cultural information, of the cultural anatomy anymore.
Yeah, my understanding, the embryologic process is the same no matter what caste you're in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and we do know that, and that reflects that in architecture or whatnot, that the people in our cultures that have access to an enormous amount of protein, their bodies are getting bigger and bigger and taller and longer, and in the favelas or in the slums, the people are short and small because they have very poor nutrition, which starts in the embryological journey very early on. You have poor nutrition for the mother. The embryological development will be reduced in its potential because of information lacking, like let's say protein lacking. Yeah, and we have a lot of access to these proteins early on, a healthy mother, and all these kind of ideals that we try to run, and then we have another potential of manifesting it. Yeah, but it's pure biology. It doesn't matter which caste. It doesn't matter male or female. It is just the pure biological developmental movement in the gestation inside the womb. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, something you said at the beginning has actually been on my mind for a bit, for various fields, but talking about how you had been taught in your training. You'd been not taught, you'd heard sort of a little bit about embryology and that there wasn't enough time for it. And uh, this is something that gets talked about in various ways. There's so much information. How do we train it all in the training? I don't think it is really possible. And yet a part of me, of course, would like it to be. I also don't know if it was trained, could it be absorbed? Could it be digested in that training at that time? Or is the hint of there is also this just enough? But I know that many people, when they're in people want to get it all. So when they're in training, you want it, you want it, you want it. But without the realization of, oh, could you actually handle it?
Yeah, well, that's one point of view to that. The other way around looking at it is if we would be exposed to the principles of developmental movement in the very beginning and get the very basics there, then it will be much easier in understanding the whole organism later because we have a foundation. We don't jump to the Vesalius big picture of the adult body, and then we try to understand all these systems and all these pieces and all this thing and all that. But when we understand the basis where the pieces come from, it would make it much easier because Blechschmidt says very, very clearly there is no systems. It is a completely artificial way of looking at the anatomy and saying there's an artery and there's a vein. It doesn't end really anywhere. There is a bone and there is a muscle and a tendon, but it's a unified field. He comes with the proposition that the body is a unified field that creates different structures that we then call bone and whatnot. And then we can see, like, it depends on the knife
Right.
of the anatomist if this ligament or this fascial layer goes over there or over there, or if this is the anterior longitudinal ligament, or if this is part of the posterior cruce of the diaphragm. How long do you go down? When you look at Blechschmidt, you see that the diaphragm starts in the sacrum, full stop. So you have an anterior tensional field that anchors at the sacrum. This is the diaphragm. When the spine gets longer, the diaphragm pulls the organs down, and so on and so on. So when you grok these principles, it actually makes things easier then in understanding an adult human structure. That's also a point of view, possibility.
Yeah, yeah. Although I don't know. I mean, I agree with you. I just don't know. Is it? How long did it take you to make things easy so that things became easier? Did you get it on the initial get go, or it took some time?
No, it took time. It took time. Yeah. One of the shortcomings then there is, if you have nobody to discuss these things with, I
Mhm,
felt pretty lonely on my journey in
mhm,
trying to figure these things out. And actually, what was helpful was like teaching.
mhm.
I was co-teaching, for example, with Susan Harper. We would use the embryo as a template and do continuum movement around some embryological themes. Or kind of a group of osteopaths invites me and I'm doing the basics of Blechschmidt, and then you get questions that you never come up yourself.
Mhm.
But there was not a group of Blechschmidt enthusiasts that where we could kind of fire each other to kind of grok that and understand that, and oh, did you get this and you see that, and I go, sometimes I go like, oh, now, like after 25 years ago, oh, how comes I didn't see that before,
Mhm.
it is a
Mhm.
big book, it is a
Mhm.
big unit of knowledge, of information, of extremely beautiful, so elegant. And then it took me quite a while. Yeah, it took me, I mean, that's honestly speaking. And now I have the principles and I can see it, so to say, how it manifests in that realm, or oh, a corrosion field. Yeah, that must be in the kidneys. There must be a corrosion field by the logic of the presentation of these ideas. So you start to kind of, it becomes open like a book. that you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, there's 2 points. One, I want to quickly say is that to some extent, what you say is one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast in particular is A, talking with people about things that interest me that I don't necessarily have access to, and B, for other people listening to get to have conversations either directly or once removed, and so that things that they may not have access to necessarily be in discussion or engagement with, they now can. And I'm not so interested in having the usual body work talks because it doesn't interest me that much. That can happen with anyone. I want to find these areas that are to me very important and maybe not as much in the forefront, so that me but also other people can um, be in relation with it. The second part was what you were saying. I don't know if we'll have time or if it'll even be possible, but that way, this is what interests me a lot. And it's not technique, I realize that, but the way that you mentioned seeing, oh, this must be in the kidneys. How is it that that becomes a part of your work? Or how is it that that's what I was kind of trying to get at before. How do you bring this to your work? How is it that either it manifests or that it informs what you do?
Mhm. Yeah. Huh. I don't know. How about that as an answer?
It's a
I
great
just don't
answer.
know.
Yeah.
No, I think there's one aspect. I remember like when the idea of the epigenetic field
Mhm.
started to happen. Rupert Sheldrake, yeah, in the 70s, 80s. Rupert
Mhm.
Sheldrake, epigenetic field, everybody was laughing about that. And now it's a common term. And there is a field beyond the genetics that is surrounding the genetics. But when Rupert Sheldrake was proposing this in the early 80s or late 70s, everybody was laughing and bullshit. Yeah. So now we have a different understanding as time goes on, and we look at that from different angles. So I don't know if it's so important how I do that. I just think it informs me, and the deeper I get into that, and I'm not reading Blechschmidt every day. Yeah? Don't misunderstand me. I have attacks. It's like every now and then I get a Blechschmidt flu, and then I'm diving into something and trying to figure out and go back and read this again. And they go, really? Did I read that already? I don't remember anything. It is a huge universe. But the epigenetic field is an example, yeah, where we look at things from that point of view. And then Buddhism came around and the relationship to the environment and the world and all these kind of things. So there is an add-on coming from the development of time that we go through. Blechschmidt per se was in a critical place because A, he was German, B, he was very smart, and for the third of it, he just didn't care. As his wife said to me, in the end, he said, the truth will show. But he didn't care about his reception, or he did not depend on selling books or things. He had a tenure on a German university and he could do whatever he wanted as long as he gave basic anatomical classes to medical students, and that's what he did. But he was living in Germany, he was in a German university throughout fascism. That was not very helpful. And then politically speaking, he was not very wise in the 60s, no, 68, 70 with the student revolution and whatnot. He was just dismissing that. He was not a very diplomatic guy. He was in a very concentrated place of looking at that. And he didn't care much about the reception of his work or not. Yeah, he could see that genetics will run the show for a long time because this is very deep, very interesting, and very helpful. And it's much easier to study a target that is fixed. All the chromosomes are there. We have all of them now. So it's like you have a target that is on the wall, and then you don't have to look at the world. But he was looking at the world and saying, gee, that's a different point of view. For me personally, I just find it intellectually very stimulating. I find it very stimulating in terms of looking at the body, like in my practical work. How do we do that? Where's the deficiency? Like currently, I'm working with a child that was born without an esophagus, and you get your ideas about what happened here. Where's the compression? Why does this form not shape and form in a correct way? So it's a ongoing question for me more than having answers. But I think the principles and the basics are not difficult to grok. And then it depends, you play guitar every day or you play guitar once a week, and it will show.
Yeah. And I think you kind of answered the way that I intended the question, because I realize it's a challenge in English, but in language. When I was saying, how is it that you sort of work with it, I wasn't necessarily meaning like the way that what I meant more was sort of what you were saying. Okay, so there's a child without an esophagus, and you are taking the understanding that you do have. I would imagine there is a felt sense of some sort that is going on, but I also understand that that would be very hard to explain how that is, as much as just a learned process, but that there is something that you are perceiving both in terms of what is there in front of you and what you have learned is a developmental process, and you are working with both of those, and then also other something or something's else.
Yeah. I mean, I did biodynamic training. I'm again in a biodynamic training. So also these things, these ideas are informative about an energetic field, about the environment, they have a point there. And I don't know how to separate that from my structural work because I don't separate that in my office. I see people and then I give them a session. And I don't know. I still find to say that's a structural integration. What I'm doing is still the best definition for me. But I am influenced by different techniques as well, a lot of visceral and a lot of biodynamic and these kind of things. How do I work with this? I come back to my initial answer. I don't know. It is a very good question. Let me think about that. How do I work with that? I don't know. There is something when I think when I do a session, I don't think in terms of anatomy. I don't think like, oh, there's this muscle and that muscle and that reach over and then it goes there. I don't think in that. It's like the anatomy goes behind a veil or the embryo goes behind a curtain, but it is in the room. It's in the back burner or however the English expression would be, but it's not in my conceptualization or my ideas of thinking a structural intervention and then of feeling the relationship with the person and sensing the hapticity of that relationship. I think it goes into the background, and there it certainly has a prominent place, I would say. But I don't differentiate it out. I don't look at it in that way, so to say.
I would imagine.
It's a passion. It became a passion to go into that thing and then to publish a couple of books and use some of these articles. Frau Blechschmidt gave me the rights to republish his scientific writings. So he did 120 articles or something in a scientific kind of, like when I can, like this is the articles he wrote in between 41 and 60. So there is heavy material with very detailed stuff. And she gave me the right to republish these things. So it's a very interesting and challenging thing also, and beautiful and a lot of work, and it doesn't pay to bring that to the surface again. So the reception might come from a different place, from a place of today, and not from the 60s or 70s or 80s when he actually did these, wrote these papers, or the 40s. But from today, with this look at, yeah, we have epigenetic field, we have the biodynamic ideas, we have the energy field and whatnot. So I think I'm trying to contribute for a reception there that it becomes available again, and people might be intrigued by it, as I was intrigued by it. But it is really a passion by now, and I don't, it's not bringing money or something like that. It's just a passion. It's beautiful, very
Yeah, but
beautiful.
it brings contentment.
It brings joy. It brings
Yeah.
happiness about that. When I go, oh, now I got, we got it,
Okay.
then there's joy and fun in it, and you go like, wow, and that's not everybody's piece of cake, I can understand that having a good surf in California beach is also bringing a lot of joy. Yeah. And
It
it's
is.
not the only thing I'm doing. Yeah. I'm not just studying Blechschmidt. It's just a passion of mine and a hobby. And I feel fortunate that Frau Blechschmidt entrusted me with this potential to republish these things and to reconnect and see how, and grateful for you to give me this opportunity to speak about it, because it is a very rewarding um, field, and it takes a while. It's a slow metabolizing these things. When suddenly you feel, oh, I got that inside me, I have understood that point.
Mhm.
We are not coming from a Vesalius point of view, but the structure is a movement.
Mm.
And that's kind of when I grok that is, oh, that's why we can change structure, because it is a movement. We're just piggyback riding this kind of thing. It is moving anyway. And we just try to help it move in a more coherent way in our understanding. And thanks
Right.
God, we have a non-moral and a non-ethical point of view, which is gravity. It's just a neutral point of view that doesn't have any bias. That's the beautiful thing about Dr. Rolf. But the thing is moving anyway. Well, from conception to death, this is a slow movement. And when you metabolize this, we are just invited by people to be along the ride for a while and help them maybe take a little different path. But we are utilizing and we are using the potential that the embryo is working with. These things have to move. There is no stagnation. And we are just kind of participating in that and add some information by pressure and tension. And that is what Blechschmidt says also. There is pressure and tension as something extremely important in terms of the formation on a very minute scale. But pressure and tension are highly important formative forces. And we are using those in our work, and that's why we can change structure or alter structure or help structure to take a little bit a different path from that road that people are on. And so that's a grateful. I'm very grateful to participate in that, and I think Dr. Rolf had a great idea with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Not understand. She doesn't really speak about embryology at all. Yeah? She
well,
speaks more about evolution than the embryo.
yeah. I mean, what I was going to say is I'm grateful that we have you in our community sharing, because it's not for, well, I would say it is for everyone, but it's not for everyone. You know what I mean? And and so for those who are, they have an access to it. And I was going to say, going past that, that one of the things I love and don't love about structural integration is that anything could fall under structural integration as long as the structure changes and there's an integrative process. And so she might not have spoken about it, but that's partly because it probably wasn't in her field of awareness. And if it had been more so, maybe she would have, maybe it would have been more a part of it, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
And you're bringing more of that in for the possibility for people to realize, hey, this actually is very important or could be very important. I would say it is very important, but it's only important once we understand that.
Yeah, and when we open ourselves to that, I think Dr. Rolf, as brilliant as that was, her understanding of what connective tissue is was an understanding of those years back then. And
Mm-hmm.
today, after Robert Schleip and all these kind of understandings now, the connective tissue is not some fabric that you push into, but the connective tissue is the surface of the brain, and we are working with all these feedback loops and all the nervous system in the same time and whatnot, and belief systems and
Mm-hmm.
a field around. And so there is a change, and she could not see that. She was a contemporary of Blechschmidt. We
Mm-hmm.
can see that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They were on a certain kind of age uh,
Mm-hmm.
uh, in the last century and produced amazing insights, both of them. And you can take Sutherland or whatnot, according to when they were there. And we see, okay, Dr. Rolf did not really have an understanding of the visceral work, and she did not ever mention the vestibular system. So over these last 30 years, we completely changed that. And her pedagogical idea about the auditing and practicing, my God, you lose a lot of time. So it was a concept, and we changed that completely. And there is more potential for change for the Rolfing community, or teaching Rolfing or learning Rolfing, or structural integration in the future. And maybe one day the embryo becomes a piece of it, maybe not. I think there's no necessity to do that. You become a brilliant Rolfer without knowing anything about the embryo.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that,
Yeah, it's by no means required. It is nice to see more of it. I'm hoping to have a few more talks with people about it because, uh, again, it's still newer to me in a lot of ways. But just seeing the importance of it, it can change stuff drastically. Like you said, understanding this person with an esophagus, how they could have got there. We could bam on the tissue to the cows come home, but then just sort of recognizing the underlying function of what actually brought them there, it saves a lot of time.
yeah, and I find it very rewarding, yeah. And I think other people look more into somatic experience and shock and trauma and the autonomic nervous system, and that is highly important and informative also for our work. So we have a beautiful body of work that integrates different aspects, and then it's up to the person and your individual choice what really kind of where you really get hooked to. Yeah, like I got hooked to the visceral work in the early 90s with this French osteopath, because I thought like this is what I need to learn, and I did, and I wouldn't want to miss it. Yeah, and I did not go down the road of somatic experiencing. But I know where these practitioners are, and I refer my people when they need somatic experiencing. So I think everybody is making their choices there. And as you said, there's so many interesting things, and I want to
Many.
learn all of them. And
Mm-hmm.
then you get overwhelmed, and you're a young Rolfer and go, and but that's the playfulness of it. And yeah, then you do it a little bit, and suddenly it's 35 years later, and you
Well,
have an experience. Yeah.
yeah, you have the benefit of that 35 years, whereas I think a lot of the people listening are still in that. I want to do it all, and that's just where they
Yeah.
are, and that's where we all are until we're not.
Yeah, and you go step by step by step. You make your choices, and you see what is the hottest item for you right now, and you go there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the embryo is an option to look into structure, to understand the body, and to understand movement per se, what we are talking about, what that means for our work. But it's an option, it's not a obligatory thing. Like we need to put that into the curriculum or whatnot. I don't think so. I would like it, but I don't think it's necessarily so that people have to learn that to understand and do better rolfing.
Hmm. Well, please think about bringing your classes back to the U.S. or to the U.S. I don't know if it's a back or two, because I think it would be great, especially if more Rolfers had access to not just your articles, but because the reading is great, but there's something about being in presence with that is much more.
No. When I'm teaching these basic classes, I realize I'm doing actually a lot of acting, and I enjoy that. Kind of it's like a stage, and you act the forces and kind of what happens here, and you fold these things together so people get an idea, and kind of ask stupid questions like, "What's the primary potential of a nerve cell?" And then you usually get as well to conduct information or to have electrical potential and but what's the primary potential of a nerve cell is it can change the relationship in between volume and surface practically unending. It can build so much surface compared to the little volume. When you see that as the primary thing, the nerve cell, a fat cell is round and has maximum volume to minimum surface, like a ball. And then you make this long axon that goes from the spine down to the toe. And you have this enormous change of surface to volume ratio. That's what a nerve cell can do. That's primary. I see. It depends on fatty acids in the environment. Oh, I see. And so on and so on. These fun things when you kind of push the clutch and take the gear shift out and wait a minute, have the engine idle a little bit on simple things like that. I enjoy that.
Well, I'd love to see about bringing you out here, figuring that out, because it'd be great to share more. For now, I need to get ready for my next client, so I'm
here. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Great. I'm happy to share this out with others, and also just to be in conversation.
My dear, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Have a great day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to us at Touching Into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Konrad at konradobermeier.de. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching Into Presence. Bye for now.